in for a treat today. I think our speaker is going to have to keep the pace up, but I'll explain that later on. Just to give you a quick idea, if you've not come across the Churches Conservation Trust before, we're a charity that was set up 50 years ago to save historic church buildings, which were of huge historic value, but no longer had a worshipping congregation. And we take on about 2 or 3 more of these churches every year. And we're wondering actually whether COVID-19 might lead to many further closures in the countryside, and there'll be more demand for our work. We work very hard to make sure that these buildings aren't just kept as monuments, but the best way for these buildings to be dealt with is that they're used and loved by the communities around them. And certainly Bellringers, we're very, very happy to work with Bellringers, and we have a great relationship with the Central Council of Church Bellringing, which we are hoping to evolve over time into something even better than it is already. COVID-19 has hit us quite hard, as it's hit many people right across the country from a personal and an organisational perspective. We've got a gap of somewhere in the region of £500,000 in our income this year, which we're trying to fill. So please do consider us when you're watching this lecture. Do donate, or at least just subscribe to our newsletter and stay in touch with us and support our work for what we do. We've been spending the last few weeks gearing our sites up to open. We've got about 156 sites open at the moment of the 356 we've got, and we're opening more every day. Do check our website if you want to go and visit. And also Champing, which is church camping, is now open for booking as well, and you can book there at champing.co.uk. It's the perfect social distancing holiday you can have. You get to spend a beautiful night overnight in one of our medieval churches, and you'll be in the middle of nowhere probably as well. So it's a fantastic adventure and definitely useful for any staycation that you're planning at the moment. So let's move on to our speaker today. We're very, very pleased to have Gareth Davis with us, who's a postgraduate researcher in history at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And he's writing his thesis at the moment on the business of bell ringing, looking at how in the 18th and 19th century people were paid to ring for events. And I was just saying to him, we're very keen to bring that back again. And if we can get bell ringers paid for ringing in sites for civic events, that would be a great thing to happen. I believe he's going to take us through 1,000 years of bell ringing history in 40 minutes. So I better not dally in handing over to Gareth now. So with great pleasure, I introduce Gareth Davis for today's lecture. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about 1,000 years of bells and bell ringing, and I apologise now for drawing many of my examples from Cambridge and East Anglia, but it's the area where my academic research is based. I can't talk about bells without letting you hear some, so I hope the technology will behave itself when I play some audio and video clips. Apologies in advance if there are any issues. Change ringing traditionally starts with the ringer of the lightest bell, the treble, announcing to the band, "Look 2, treble's going." So here goes, "Look 2, treble's going." Bells have, of course, been silent during the COVID lockdown, and at least until last Sunday, when some were able to ring again for church services under very limited circumstances. But bell ringers are determined people, and in the absence of real bells, they've been making use of the kind of technology used to play online games in order to practice and keep in touch with each other. And Ringing Room, which you can see on the screen, was developed only 3 months ago, but now has nearly 3,500 active virtual towers and more than 5,500 active ringers. It's even possible to ring at towers that have no real bells, such as Ely Cathedral, one of only 3 English cathedrals that currently have no change ringing bells. Church towers first started to appear in the 7th century. They spread from Italy across Europe, eventually reaching Britain, and they had roles as places of defence and observation, as navigation markers for travellers, and as indicators of prestige. They also had symbolic value, of course, the church reaching up towards heaven. However, there's little doubt that their most important practical function was to house one or more bells. But building towers could be a slow process. It may only have been possible to build about 10 feet a year because of the need to allow the weight to settle and to give the masons time to prepare the stone over winter for the next season's building. The danger of collapse could be strong, and that may account for some towers that were disconnected from the rest of the church. That at Salisbury Cathedral, seen on the right of the engraving, was demolished in 1792 and all but one of its 10 bells lost, making it the second of the English cathedrals to have no peal of bells, and sadly depriving eager Russian tourists of another point of interest. Towers were also expensive structures to erect, and shortage of funds could lead to protracted delays in completion. The church may often have acquired its bells before the tower was completed. It was not unusual, therefore, for the bells to be housed in temporary structures, often for protracted periods. When Great St Mary's Church in Cambridge was being rebuilt in the 15th and 16th centuries, work on the new tower began in 1491, but it took 117 years before the tower was finally completed. And for much of that period, the 4 bells were housed first in a thatched shed at ground level, and then within the partially completed tower. But what do you do when your bells have no prospect of a tower to put them in? And that was the position at East Bergholt in Suffolk. The bells were hung in a wooden cage in 1531 while the tower was built. It's likely that it was never completed because the money ran out, but a local legend has it that the builders were disheartened by the devil, who visited every night and undid their work until they gave up. Instead, the bells were rung, and still are, uniquely by pushing them by hand rather than pulling on ropes. As you can see from this short video, it's not for the faint-hearted.
Hands up, order.
Right up. Right.
I had the dubious pleasure of ringing those in the 1970s before ear defenders became de rigueur, and being that close to a striking bell was the first time that I really thought there might be something to the main plot device in the classic detective story about bell ringing. But you'll have to read The Nine Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers to find out more. Nevertheless, despite these examples of bells in unusual structures, most bells did make it to the top of their church towers. And it was from there that the power of their sound really came into its own. Hearing bells more than 5 miles away was not uncommon. And of the 3 loudest sounds in pre-industrial England, thunder, cannon, fire, and bells, bells were almost certainly the most frequently heard. In a sermon in 1552, Hugh Latimer, Bishop of Worcester, dismissed the superstition that the devil could be defeated by the ringing of bells. If that worked, he said, then England would already have driven him out. Because, quote, if all the bells in England should be rung together at a certain hour, there would be almost no place but one bell might be heard there. Latimer's claims about the pervasiveness of church bells in England were certainly borne out by Edward VI's inventory of church property, first carried out in 1552. Though not complete for the whole country, as this map of Cambridge shows, many churches had at least 3 or 4 great bells at that time, as well as smaller Sanctus or Saint's bell. And 3 years before that inventory was made, Martin Bucer, one of the leading continental Protestant reformers who had been given sanctuary in England, included in his writings some revealing comments about bell ringing at the time, which neatly set out the different strands of activity for which those numerous bells were being employed. And he had 2 particular complaints. One was about the recreational use of bells by foolish youths, and the other about the clanging of the bells day and night on superstitious festivals. He said, there ought not to be any other use for this sound than that the people should prepare themselves and come to the sacred assembly or to other public gatherings. Though he may not have approved of all those uses, Bucer had neatly identified 3 strands of activity that were to define the uses of church bells for the next 5 centuries. Ringing for worship, ringing for civic occasions and meetings, and ringing for recreation. However, the thickness of each strand has varied considerably during that time, and each at some point has become rather frayed. None of those strands were entirely new in 1551. Ringing bells to call people to worship had grown out of the use of bells to mark the daily monastic cycle of the liturgy of the hours, with prayers at matins, lauds, and so on. And by the 13th century, it's clear from the statutes of the various English bishoprics that sounding a bell before services had transferred to parish churches. In 1287, for instance, the statutes of Exeter specified that the priest should make the bells ring the canonical hours, from which sound the people are roused when they should go to church to hear divine office. However, the transfer from monastic to parish settings didn't always go smoothly, and bells could be the subject of intense disputes. At Wymondham in Norfolk, open hostility broke out between the monks of the abbey and the local parishioners over access to the bells, which were housed in what was then a shared religious building, both priory and parish church. When the parishioners found themselves blocked from using the bells, they responded in 1409 by stealing the prior's cattle, cutting down the trees in the churchyard, and eventually forcing the prior into hiding in his chambers. Whilst the dispute was continuing, the parishioners managed to hang 3 bells in a temporary structure above the north porch. However, when a commission arrived in 1411 to try and resolve the dispute, the parishioners complained that it wasn't tall enough to provide an adequate solution, the bells couldn't be heard, services were being missed, and children were not being baptised. The dispute was only eventually resolved when the parish was allowed to build a new west tower to house its own bells. The parishioners' concerns in that case seem to have been mainly religious, but civic use of the bells was also becoming well established, and the lines were becoming blurred between sacred and secular uses. The curfew bell, which had briefly marked the legal requirement to cover fires at night in the 11th century, continued in use both as an ave, a reminder to say a Hail Mary to the Virgin as night fell, and to mark the end of the working day and the time when taverns and shops should shut. An early morning bell, mandated by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1399, as a signal that Our Father and 5 Hail Marys should be said, translated into a signal that the working day was beginning. And inscriptions cast into the bells are a useful indicator of the purposes to which they were put. A 14th century bell at Christchurch Priory in Dorset claimed to drive away pestilence, for instance. And others signalled the opening of markets, the availability of the baker's oven, or acted as a fire alarm. Ringing also supposedly protected against storms and lightning, though I have to say that swinging large metal objects during a thunderstorm might be regarded as a recipe for disaster. And indeed, many church towers were struck by lightning, whether or not the bells were ringing. Perhaps one of the best examples of the contested meaning of bell ringing and of how sacred ringing became more secular is found in the story of St. Hugh's Day. St. Hugh was the Bishop of Lincoln in the 12th century and was canonised in 1220. When Lincoln College, Oxford was founded by a later Bishop of Lincoln in the 15th century, the college statutes required that the feast of St. Hugh on the 17th of November be particularly observed. The college was strongly pro-Catholic in the 1570s, and when some of the St. Hugh's Day revellers went to ring All Hallows bells for exercise, the story has it that the mayor rushed to stop them, believing that they were commemorating the Catholic Queen Mary, who by a coincidence had died and been succeeded by Elizabeth I on St. Hugh's Day, 17th of November. When the ringers claimed that they were indeed celebrating Queen Elizabeth's accession, the mayor had all the other city churches rung as well. But Oxford was by no means the first place where bells rang for Elizabeth's accession. By the early 1570s, the custom was spreading rapidly throughout the country, and at Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire, a transitional stage in the change from ringing for the saint to ringing for the monarch was nicely illustrated by the churchwarden's entry in their accounts for 1575, when 2 shillings and 8pence was spent on bread, drink and cheese for ringing on St. Hugh's Day in rejoicing of the Queen's prosperous reign. By the end of the reign, Hugh had largely been excised from the records in favour of the Queen's accession. But bells had rung to mark royal events well before Elizabeth's reign, but such occasions were now becoming both more frequent and more formalised. Churches were fined if they failed to ring during visits by the Queen, and she or her spin doctors were becoming very aware that bells could provide a reminder of the power of the throne. They enabled Elizabeth and her successors to be symbolically present in parishes across the country, even if she couldn't be everywhere in person. Over the next 100 years, bells as a representation of monarchy became embedded in the national calendar as the occasions on which they rang extended to include not just the anniversary of the accession, but of the coronation, the monarch's birthday, sometimes their consort's birthday, the Prince of Wales' birthday, the escape of King and Parliament from gunpowder treason on the 5th of November, and after 1660, for Oak Apple Day celebrations for the restoration of the monarchy on the 29th of May. However, as the civic importance of bells was increasing, their use in religious practice was declining. Many saints' days, when the bells would once have rung, were excised from the religious calendar. The new prayer books only required one bell to be rung to call people to church. The Puritan Nicholas Bound argued in his Doctrine of the Sabbath in 1585 that only a single bell was appropriate on Sundays to call worshippers to church, not the jangling of bells that is used in too many places and the disordered ringing at other times of the Sabbath and for other ends. And strict Sabbatarian views such as those seem to have held sway at the Canterbury Convocation that resulted in revised Anglican canon laws in 1604. 4 of the canons mention bells. 2 are about their use for church purposes. The other 2 specified that bells should not be rung superstitiously and required the church wardens to present the names at visitations of those who had hindered the priest by untimely ringing of bells, another indication of the tensions between the different uses to which they were being put. And yet, despite only one bell being required in each church, their numbers were increasing significantly. There are lots of caveats about this graph. Many earlier bells, of course, would have been lost or recast, but leaving aside the detail, the overall pattern suggests a significant increase in bell founding activity, and that's supported by what we know about the number of bells hung in individual churches. From most churches at the time of the 1552 survey having just 3 or 4 bells, it was estimated that 100 years later, there were more than 1,000 with rings of 5 or more. And that investment continued. In the 17th century, it's reckoned that 350 complete new rings of bells were cast, but that had leapt to 1,350 in the 18th century and a further 1,200 in the 19th. What was it that prompted such a huge investment in new bells? Was there an element of competition between parishes? Had the bell founders developed particularly persuasive marketing techniques? Possibly, but much of the answer probably lies in the third strand of bell ringing activity, its development as a recreational pastime. Once bells were hung so that they could swing, there must have been a temptation to swing them higher and higher, just like a child on a swing. Doing so required a certain amount of physical effort, especially without the benefit of modern ball bearings, and that effort increased the heavier the bell. Paul Hentzner, a German lawyer, wrote at the end of the 16th century that the English were vastly fond of great noises that fill the ear, so that it is common for a number of them to go up into some belfry and ring the bells for hours together for the sake of exercise. Now, most sets of bells in English churches were tuned as consecutive notes running down a major scale to the note of the heaviest bell or tenor. And you can, of course, ring them in that order down the octave in what ringers call rounds. Or you can choose a different order to strike the bells in. With early bell hanging methods, though, what it was very difficult to do was to change the order once the bells had started swinging. Slowing them down to ring later in the order or speeding them up to ring sooner was hard to achieve and couldn't be accomplished instantly. If you wanted to ring a new pattern, you had to first stop and then start again in a different order. But that problem was solved by technical developments. Running the bell around a wheel attached to the bell rather than to a lever or to the bell itself enabled the ringers to change the timing of the bell's strike. The wheels enabled the bell to be swung to a point where it could be paused. And you can see in this split screen video how the bell can gradually be swung higher and higher until it's upside down and reaches
To
balance.
raise the bell to its upside down position, the ringer has to swing the bell higher and higher until the bell is turning full circle. This is known as raising the bell or ringing up.
Once you can pause the bell at the end of each swing, or speed it up, you can change the order the bells ring in while the ringing is in progress. And knowing when to change can be done in two ways. Someone can shout out a new order for the bells to ring in. This is known as call changes. And it's one of the earliest stages in learning change ringing, though in parts of the West Country, it's developed into an art form in its own right. This example was recorded at Yalmpton, South Devon in 2019. You can hear the conductor regularly calling out the numbers of the two bells who are required to change their places in the order. Call changes was probably the start for change ringing, but its development took a different turn. Rather than leave it to the conductor to decide what the next change would be, predetermined sequences of changes, called methods, were developed that each ringer would learn and then ring without the conductor needing to announce them. The first change ringing handbook appeared in 1668 and contained the instructions for ringing such methods, mainly on 5 and 6 bells, including ones with intriguing names such as paradox, phoenix, and watching please, as well as ones with apparently geographical origins such as Cambridge and Reading. And it's a measure of the speed with which the number of bells was increasing and change ringing being advanced that when the second handbook, Campanologia, appeared 9 years later, it already contained many methods for 7 and 8 bells, not just 5 and 6. One of the things that immediately engaged change ringers was to work out how many different combinations of the bells it was possible to ring and how long it would take to ring them. On 2 bells, 2 changes are possible. On 3 bells, 6. Multiplying 1 by 2 by 3 by 4 gives us 24 changes on 4, and the pattern continues on 5 and 6. And Sir Isaac Newton's notebook for 1665 shows that he too had worked out how to obtain the numbers for 6 bells. Indeed, the problem was so well known by the early 18th century that it appeared in mathematical textbooks, with the additional challenge of working out how long it would take to ring all the possible combinations. And as you can see, Nicholas Saunderson reckoned, probably fairly accurately, that it would take 45 years to ring all the possible changes on 12 bells. It would be quite easy to think that this development of change ringing was a rather niche activity. However, in fact, it seems to have rapidly developed a place in general public consciousness. Ringing became seen as an art fit for the genteel as well as the plebeian, and rather mangled extracts of the early change ringing manuals found their way into more general guides to gentlemanly pursuits. So Robert Howlett's School of Recreation, frequently republished after 1684, promoted the benefits of ringing alongside hunting, hawking, riding, and so on. And if a gentleman fancied the exercise but not the sound of bell ringing, then dumb bells had been developed to provide a more individual and quieter experience. In 1711, Joseph Addison, editor of The Spectator, noted that, "I exercise myself an hour every morning upon a dumb bell that is placed in the corner of my room, and it pleases me the more because it does everything I require of it in the most profound silence." Ringing was also providing inspiration for more traditional forms of music. In 1676, Thomas Mace had published Music's Monument, in which he compared the principles of change ringing with some aspects of lute playing. And his contemporary, the composer John Jenkins, produced even more substantial compositions that drew directly from the patterns of change ringing and were named appropriately, including the 6 bells, the 5-bell concert, and the ringers. By its nature, change ringing was a team activity, and inevitably it led to the formation of ringing societies. These were not new. The earliest known guild of bellringers was appointed in Westminster in 1254, and several had been formed in the early 17th century. The Lincoln Cathedral Company dated to 1612, the St Stephen's Bristol Society to 1620, and the London-based Ancient Society of College Youths to 1637. Many of these societies came and went, but the College Youths remains to this day the longest surviving active change ringing society. And driven by the growth of change ringing and also by a huge explosion of new clubs and societies of all kinds in the 18th century, many new ringing societies formed and flourished in the 1700s. And competition between them helped to push forward the boundaries of change ringing, in the complexity of what was rung, in the number of bells that were rung, and in how long they were rung for. In 1715, the Norwich scholars were the first to complete a peal that contained all of the 5,040 changes that are possible on 7 bells, taking 3 hours and 18 minutes of continuous ringing to do so, at the Church of St. Peter Mancroft, not at Norwich Cathedral, which is the last of the 3 English cathedrals with no peals of bells. This performance set a benchmark for full peals, that whatever number of bells were rung, they should contain at least 5,000 changes, though that number was frequently exceeded. As well as publishing their triumphs in local newspapers, bands also installed peal boards on the walls of the ringing rooms, not all as elaborate as the Norwich one from 1715, or the Cambridge performance of 6,600 changes on 12 bells from 1778. The boards are interesting historically, but they also give today's ringers a direct link with the past, as they are overlooked by the names of their predecessors. Perhaps surprisingly to us now, ringing for such extended periods seems not to have caused complaints. Indeed, notable attempts such as these could attract large crowds of listeners from amongst the local population. Though the epithet the ringing isle has been attributed to Handel, it was already in common currency long before his arrival in London in 1712, and indeed before 1640, when Thomas Fuller wrote, "Outlandish men call our land the rainy land, because we have such plenty thereof, arising of the store of vapours from the vicinity of the sea. They call it also the ringing island, because it hath bells so many and so tuneable." Those outlandish foreign visitors, on the other hand, were not always impressed by what they heard. When the German traveller and scholar Conrad van Uffenbach visited Cambridge in 1710, he commented in his diary, "The English make much ado of their chimes, and aim at an artistic and agreeable style of ringing, but we could not fancy the clatter, rather were much annoyed to hear it so often. For the scholars or young students mount the towers and ring when they please, often for hours together." But as well as these extended performances, bands also began to travel to try their skills on new bells. Well-regarded societies were invited to open new rings, and competitions were organised for all comers, often as a commercial venture by local innkeepers, where the prize might be a set of hats or gloves. And Daniel Defoe's true account of the activities of the early 18th century highwayman and general rogue Jonathan Wild neatly summarised the enthusiasm for betting and ringing amongst men of leisure, as well as the potential risks of participating in competitions. Wild recounted how a member of his gang had approached a parcel of rich citizens who took a singular pleasure in ringing bells. In summertime, they travelled from place to place, wherever they heard of a good ring of bells, in order to divert themselves with ringing, and to try where were the sweetest bells. One night, when they were pretty warm with wine, and boasting of their great excellence in ringing, our spark offered that he and 5 more he would bring should ring with them for 200 guineas, provided he was to name the bells. They took up his challenge, and Lincoln Cathedral was named as the venue for the wager. When the ringers arrived at Lincoln by coach or on horse with the £200 for their wager, they were met punctually by their challenger and his band, who offered to let them ring first. The citizens immediately stripped themselves in order to put on their ringing dresses, and while they were beginning to try the bells, one of our people conveyed away their clothes and left the citizens to enjoy all their music themselves. Wilde commented that this theft of their clothes and this expedition was worth near £300 in money, for all they carried was in their breeches pockets. I say £300 because besides there were watches, snuff boxes, tobacco boxes, clothes and periwigs. On that occasion, the ringers suffered a significant financial loss. However, there was also money to be made from ringing. The sums that could be earned have often been regarded as relatively trivial, because the most common sources for information about what ringers were paid are the parish records, and in particular the church warden's accounts. Slide shows the number of times that the ringers were paid by the church wardens at one of the smaller churches in Cambridge at the end of the 17th century. However, such payments tell only part of the story, especially for ringing in more urban areas. The payments on the recorded on the slide obviously relate to the events for which the parish took responsibility. By and large, payments by the church wardens were modest, usually a few shillings, and the ringers invariably received their reward in beer rather than cash. Money was left with the landlord of one of the parish inns, and the ringers took refreshment after their exercise. The amounts increased very little through the 18th and 19th century, providing perhaps enough for each ringer to have 2 or 3 pints of ale. However, particularly in urban settings, there were organisations and individuals other than the parishes that were prepared to pay, and pay in cash, for the bells to be rung. In many places, there are only occasional records surviving of such payments. However, in Cambridge, the Ringing Society, formed in 1724, the Cambridge Youths, kept detailed records of all the payments they received, and their account books show how their income steadily increased through the 18th century, with the sums shown on the screen converted to the 2017 equivalent. For most of the period, they charged £1 guinea a ring for marriages, local government events and appointments, university ceremonies, parliamentary elections, the twice-yearly assizes, and a whole variety of one-off events, from the opening of the railway, visits by learned societies, the annual agricultural show, successful court cases, lottery wins, and personal advancements. And such payments were by no means a Cambridge phenomenon. A parliamentary inquiry into the election result at Evesham in 1837 revealed that the ringers at Bengeworth, one of the towers on the edge of the town, had been paid by 2 of the 3 candidates to ring for 5 or 6 hours a day for 21 consecutive days while the election was taking place. The 3rd candidate too had promised to pay, but changed his mind when he discovered that one of the ringers hadn't voted for him. But even without his contribution, the 6 ringers shared more than £40, or about £3,500 at 2017 prices. They undoubtedly worked hard for it, but it was probably still a better return than Henry Heritage, the foreman of the ringers, earned from his day job as a basket maker. What we have then is a picture of bell ringing in the 18th and early 19th centuries that is centred on the various pleasures of change ringing and an opportunity in some places to earn a useful second income. The call to church is performed by the sexton or parish clerk, chiming 1 or 2 bells on Sunday. Change ringing does not feature as an aspect of religious worship. It's an entirely secular activity. In terms of our 3 strands, therefore, recreational and civic use of bells is extensive and growing. The use of the bells by the church has not changed significantly for 200 years. It does, though, begin to change during the second half of the 19th century for reasons that were cultural, social, and religious. The Church of England itself, of course, was changing in response to the challenges of the dissenting churches, Catholic emancipation in the 1820s, threats to its established status, and the need and costs of catering to a rapidly expanding urban population, while at the same time losing its right to raise church rates. There was a new sense of what was proper and appropriate, and several new brooms were sweeping through Anglicanism. The remaining West End bands of musicians were swept away, and untuneful parish clerks replaced by choirs. It was inevitable that sooner or later the church would turn its attention to the belfry and the activities of the ringers. Muted early 18th century complaints that ringing was mean and mechanical, inappropriate for gentlemen, and led to drunkenness and neglect of families, resurfaced in the 19th century in the mouths of a small but vocal group of clergymen who pressed for belfry reform, claiming rather sweepingly, for instance, that ringers were the most profane and profligate persons in the parish, who, totally ignorant of the sacred character and heavenly uses of those holy instruments they are desecrating, ring the bells for their amusement amid oaths and obscenity, and sell their voices for drink money or for any worldly purpose. Now, one must take some of those claims with a large pinch of salt, but they nevertheless reflected a more general change in attitude to pastimes that had previously been enjoyed by men of all classes, but in the 19th century were becoming increasingly regarded as plebeian, dissolute, and inappropriate. And the Belfry Reformers had a natural platform for expressing their views when their most prominent advocate, the Reverend Henry Ellicombe, became editor of the bell-ringing section of Erskine Clarke's new publication, Church Bells, a magazine that paved the way in 1870 for later journals entirely dedicated to bell ringing. But even without the efforts of the reformers, it's likely that some change would have happened. The roles of parishes were also in flux. Until the 19th century, ecclesiastical parishes had a number of local government functions. And if one thinks of towers and bells as supporting the civic activities of the parish, it's easier to see why the vestries and churchwardens were so willing to pay for the bells and for them to be rung for non-religious events. However, those responsibilities were stripped away by the 1860s, and parish payments for bell ringing tail off significantly at that point. The Belfry Reformers did not always agree on the detail of what they were seeking or how it should be achieved, but the overall aim was to bring change ringing into the service of the church and have bell ringers recognised as church officers, with the concomitant expectations of how they would behave when recognised as such. One response of the ringers to the various threats they faced was to band together in order to address some of them. From the 1870s onwards, diocesan and county associations began to be formed. Nearly all those associations had some type of belfry reform as one of their stated aims. Many were led by members of the clergy, a group that had been equally criticised by the belfry reformers for ignoring the state of their bells and the behaviour of their ringers. And now a significant number of clergymen also learned to ring, enabling them to take active part in the various associations. And the final piece in the organisational pyramid was achieved with the formation of the Central Council of Church Bellringers in 1891, with the emphasis on church and providing national representation to bell ringers and their regional associations. Of course, with all change, nothing changed overnight. As the 20th century approached, bell ringing was still largely a recreational activity. But in addition to changes within the church, it was also being affected by wider social change. It's an irony that after centuries of the sound of bells ringing for extended periods being a source of pride and joy, at least to Britons, if not to foreign visitors, then ringing began to find itself open to complaints of noise nuisance, just as the sound of bells began to be drowned by the sounds of industrial Britain. And that new public sensitivity ironically also coincided with a period when the bell founders were making major breakthroughs in tuning techniques, resulting in the production of some of the most beautiful sounding peals of bells that had ever been produced. A single church bell produces more than one note, and the quality of its overall sound depends on whether those separate notes can be brought into harmony with one another by removing just the right amounts of metal at different points on the casting. Pre-industrial bell founders relied on their ears and a hammer to chip away metal in an attempt to tune a bell. The later 19th century, better understanding of harmonics, the invention of tuning forks and powered lathes literally revolutionized the process. Most church bells continued to be made of bell metal, roughly 77% copper and 23% tin. But inevitably there are experiments with new, cheaper materials, especially steel. Of course, not all bells sound the same. Most are held in local affection, but there's no doubt that some bells sound better than others. So here are two extremes. The steel bells of Tollerwelm in Dorset, cast in 1868, and the traditional bells of Chewton Mendip in Somerset, cast in 1913 by the Taylor Foundry in Loughborough, now the only remaining dedicated bell foundry in Britain. I know which church I'd rather live next to. Another change that reflected the times was the participation of women in change ringing. It had been an entirely male pursuit until late in the 19th century, and perhaps that's no surprise. One of the purchases made for the ringing room at Great St Mary's had been a chamber pot, and no doubt it was well used. But in 1896, Rosetta Alice White, aged 16, marked the start of a new era by ringing 5,040 changes at St Michael's Basingstoke, the first woman to ring a full tower bell peal. And the absence of many bell ringers during the Great War also encouraged churches to seek their replacements amongst the female population. It's currently estimated that more than 1,400 bell ringers were killed during the First World War and another 400 between 1939 and 1945. Though new names are still being discovered. Bells rang out enthusiastically for peace at the end of both conflicts and continue today to remember such events. However, if we take stock of where ringing is today in relation to the three strands, probably what I've called civic ringing is at its weakest. Most of the secular uses of bells that were commonplace in the 18th and 19th centuries have disappeared. We no longer ring for general elections and by-elections, for instance. Ringing as a recreation still survives. It's founded on the many weekly local practices that take place in churches across the country. For those capable and willing to push the boundaries of what can be achieved, the complexity of the methods being attempted and the number of bells rung has continued to develop. There are now 2 rings of 16 bells, one in Birmingham and one in the Swan Tower in Perth in Australia. Full peals lasting several hours continue to be rung, but the popularity of such extended ringing has been dipping for a number of years. Bell ringing competitions at diocesan, county or national level continue to take place and are generally well supported, especially the National 12 Bell competition and the National Young Ringers competition, which attract hundreds of participants. Of the 16,000 Anglican churches in the UK, just under 7,000 have rings of 3 or more bells, the vast majority in England. Of those, about 1,000 are currently unringable because of the state of either the bells or the tower. There are also about 200 rings in Roman Catholic churches, and outside the UK, there are another 150 churches with English change ringing bells. The number of active bell ringers is not exactly known. The best estimate is probably that it's somewhere between 35 and 40,000, or just under 1 ringer for each of the 42,000 bells now hanging in church towers. But the geographic distribution of churches and bells has for at least 2 centuries not matched the changing distribution of the population. As a result, many rural towers have no ringers and the bells are rarely heard. Though it's not uncommon now for ringers to ring at more than 1 church on Sundays, or to rotate around a benefice, depending on where the services are being held. In urban areas, it's arguable that the population is large enough to recruit many more ringers, but there would not necessarily be enough bells for them to ring, though it would be a nice problem to have. That there is still an appetite for learning to ring was illustrated in 2018, when the plan to recruit 1,400 new ringers, 1 for each ringer killed in the Great War, eventually resulted in more than double that number signing up. There has, though, been a sea change in the nature of the new recruits. 50 years ago, most would have been teenagers. Today's recruits are often from, let's say, a slightly older generation. The uses that bells have been put to have altered and adapted to the social, religious and political changes for many centuries. It'll be interesting to see how their use develops during the next decades, especially in the light of the serious challenges faced by the Church of England, and in particular how it deals with falling congregations and the costs of maintaining thousands of medieval buildings. I thought an appropriate end to this would be to end with the bells nearest to my home, which Peter has already mentioned. The six at St Cyriax and St Julita in Swaffham Prior in Cambridgeshire, cast in 1791. The village is unusual in having two churches in the same churchyard. St Cyriax on the right is in the care of the Church's Conservation Trust and has the bells. However, we ring them for the services in the adjoining church of St Mary's, which has no bells. Here's what they sound like. I often reflect when I ring them about what other form of music making I could take part in where I'd be regularly allowed to use an instrument that was several centuries old. In that clip, you may have heard someone at the end call "that's all" the traditional signal that the ringing has come to an end. So let me just say, that's all, and thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gareth. That was fantastic. And I know, as a ringer myself, I've learned so much from that. So thank you so much for taking the time there. We're now moving into question time, everyone. So please do use the comment box. Do type any questions you have for Gareth, and we'll do our best to answer them. So we've had a couple come in already, Gareth. So I'm going to dive right in. Question number one. What is the oldest bell in the country and at which church?
I can tell you it's in Hampshire, and it was cast in, I think, 1280. So that's the oldest ringable bell that's still ringable. I can't remember exactly which church it is, and I may have got the year slightly wrong, but we're talking about the 13th century, essentially.
So the bells can last for hundreds of years.
Yes. Yeah, but they need to be used.
And on to another question here. Someone's commented, I'm at RHS Holbrook, just down the road from East Bergholt. Our school bells are in the clock tower, not the chapel. However, the bells are quite low, and I was told yesterday that it was designed so that a water collection tank would be above the bells. Is this unusual? Are there any other examples of water collection tanks above bells in a tower?
It's not one I know the answer to, I'm afraid. I think one of the things you regularly find above bells and towers these days is phone masts, mobile phone masts, which have found a home at the top of church towers.
Thanks, Gareth. We've had a question here. You mentioned near the start about 3 strands.
Yeah.
And someone's commented here, which of the 3 strands you mentioned would you say A, was most important, and B, most prevalent nowadays?
I think undoubtedly that the 2 strands at the moment that are most prevalent are ringing for services at church and recreational ringing. It's the kind of civic events that seem to have fallen by the wayside, the ones that the ringers got paid for.
And you mentioned also in the lecture there that bell ringers had ringing dress. Do we have any idea of what the ringing dress may have looked like? Yes,
I didn't include the short description that Wilde gave of what it was, but it's according to his description, it consisted of drawers, waistcoats, and caps. I have to say it's the only occasion I've come across where ringers have been described as ringing in particular dress. Certainly in the 19th century, the photographs of ringers show them ringing in pretty much their everyday work clothes.
Keep the questions coming, everyone, so please do use that comment box there and ask away. We've talked a bit about what you mentioned, Gareth, as English style ringing. What is, in sort of a nutshell, the main difference between English style ringing and maybe continental ringing?
Yes, we have to, I think, first thing to say is there isn't a single style of continental ringing. So the thing that distinguishes English change ringing really is that use of the wheel and the bell swinging full circle so that it swings from the up position to the up position. There's something very similar that happens in northern Italy. It's not quite the same, but it kind of similar-ish techniques. But in the Low Countries, the developments were not so much in that kind of ringing, but more in carillons and playing more traditional music on carillons. So bells connected by wires or ropes to a wooden keyboard.
So you mentioned about peals being invented, sort of in the certainly after the Reformation, but sort of before then, would be more sort of plenum style rings, so just tolling the bells till that stage. You think?
Yes, I think they would have been swinging and chiming the bells. So swinging, so the bells hanging mouth down, being swung, and then checked to make the bells swing.
Brilliant. And tell us a bit about yourself. So how long have you been ringing for?
I started ringing in 1970, so I've got a milestone coming up.
And have you rung many peals?
I've rung about 850.
That's a lot of
Yes.
ringing outings there. And would you say, certainly you're based in East Anglia, that the condition of bells in that region, they're quite good, or there's quite a lot of good ringing towers to get out to?
I think yes. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, there are lots of good bells all over the place. I mean, I don't think East Anglia is the most notable area of the country for fantastic sounding bells, but it has its fair share. But the rural counties, Norfolk, Suffolk, and so on, you know, there are every small village has bells, and not all of them, unfortunately, have bands to ring them.
So if we've got lots of viewers here, and undoubtedly a lot of these people here haven't really had an introduction to bells. Obviously, at the moment, it's really hard to get into our towers to go bell ringing. But once restrictions ease and people can get ringing, where do you think they should go if they want to actually explore having a go at bell ringing?
So the easiest thing to do would be to go along to their local church, find out if there's a regular bell ringing practice. Usually churches display the names of the ringing secretary. If not, you can contact the vicar or the church wardens and ask if they can come along and see what it's like. There's no pressure. You can have a demonstration. Usually most people end up having a go before the end of the evening. And there's no restriction really on age. We have ringers from 9 to 90.
It's a great all age and sort of, you know, that whole idea of it being a communal activity and a great way to make new friends.
I occasionally joke with people that when I started bell ringing, the average age of my friends tripled overnight.
Well, that's not a bad thing. It's great to meet people from all different ages. That's a great thing about using these church buildings, is that actually it's a great melting pot, and you can meet so many different people you may not, or get to normally meet in your day-to-day life. More questions coming in. Where can people find out about national bell ringing competitions and going to have a listen to them?
Okay, so if you do a search on the internet for National 12 Bell Competition, that will come up with a link to the site for the National 12 Bell Ringing Competition, which happens once a year in non-COVID years. And there are a number of eliminators around the country, and then the final is held somewhere different every year. And it's a place to go to hear really good quality ringing.
And you've mentioned there about COVID, and sort of, COVID has shut a lot of our churches, although CCT churches are beginning to reopen, and we're working on policies for hopefully in the future being able to have bells ringing again. Have there been other times in history where bells have been silenced from being rung?
So the only period that I'm aware of where bells have ceased entirely was during the Second World War. Until 1943, bells were forbidden to be rung because they were being reserved as a warning of invasion. That restriction was lifted in 1943. But even during the First World War, there was only a partial ban on ringing in some parts of the country. So really, COVID is probably only the second occasion where every bell in the country has fallen silent at the same time.
No, it's really, really quite sad, isn't it? But as I said, we look forward to hearing bells ringing once again. I think I've got a couple more questions to get through, and then we'll probably have to call it a day. But a couple more questions here, Gareth. So, which ring of bells that you have rung at are the best in your mind?
So there's quite a lot of factors come in here. I mean, if you want to hear a fantastic sounding ring of bells, then the ones at Chewton Mendip that I played are great. If you're talking about ones that I really like hearing and have an emotional connection to, then I'd have to say the new bells at Great St Mary's in Cambridge, which were installed in 2009. They are both beautiful sounding and easy to ring.
Brilliant. And finally, someone's commented here, I ring out a 5-bell tower. Do you know how many towers there are with only 5 bells?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there is a fantastic website called Dove's Guide to Church Bells. If you put in a search for Dove's Guide, and it will give you the detail of every church in the country which has bells, more than 3 bells, and how many bells there are, who cast them, when they were cast, and a whole lot of information. And it will also let you search for all the 5-bell towers in the country.
Brilliant. So you've heard it there, everyone. A great resource to use there. And
Dove's Guide, D-O-V-E, Dove's Guide. Yeah.
And I think a couple of people have commented links in the comment box there with links to those pages, to do check those out. Also, do look at, as Gareth alluded to, different Diocese Association ringing sites. So if you live in Suffolk, there's Diocese of St Edmundsbury and Ipswich have one, but wherever you live in the country, there will be a ringing guild. So do check out those websites, because they've got great resources and local contacts you might be able to get in contact with. But as I said, that's everything, all the time we have for today's lecture. Again, thank you to Gareth. I hope you've really enjoyed this. I know I've really enjoyed it. So please do consider making a donation if you enjoyed it. As I said, there's links in the video description, but if you'd like to make a text donation, just text CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £3. Now, next week, it's a doubly special week because we've got 2 lectures taking place. Dr. Christina Welch from the University of Winchester, who's the course director for the MA in Deaf, Religion and Culture, will be given a free taster lecture from the master's degree. And that will be exploring deaf theory and Victorian cemeteries. And there's details of that in our events page. Next week on Thursday, however, for our Thursday lunchtime lecture, we're going to be joined by Dr. Emma Wells from the University of York, who's going to be talking to us about naughty things in parish churches. So things you may not expect to see in a church, we're going to be covering. So do join us for that. And again, there's more details of that on our event page. Now, if you've had any difficulties joining today's lecture, do send us a direct message, because we are looking for ways to improve and make it easier for you to join. But again, once again, thank you so much to Gareth for taking the time, and thank you for joining today's lecture. We hope you've enjoyed it. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.